Our Ask the Farmer Q&A session. My name is Brigid Barry and I coordinate the Farming for Nature project. I'm joined tonight with my co-host, Dr. Brendan Dunford, who is a founding member of Farming for Nature, but his day job is managing the Burren Programme up in County Clare. Farming for Nature was set up to inspire and encourage farmers that farm or wish to farm more for nature. And one of the ways we do this is each year we find exemplary farmers that are doing extraordinary work alongside nature on their farms. And the Q&A series is a great way of meeting these farmers and asking questions of them and finding out their farming practices. So we are delighted to have a guest speaker every Monday night, and we will Brendan and I will kickstart the event with asking our guest speaker some questions, and then we ask that you write into the chat box any questions that you might have, and so that you can join in the conversation. And again, if you actually know some of the answers as well to some of the questions that are in the chat box, feel free to put the answers in as well. So on to tonight's session. We are delighted to have Kildare farmer Andrew Bergin join us. Andrew is part of many different initiatives, including Base Ireland, the Farmland EIP and the Danube project. He took over the farm from his father in the late 80s and has been working on it ever since. He's a tillage farmer on 320 acres up in Grattensburg in County Kildare. But I think he'll tell us more about his light bulb moment about 6 years ago and how that led him down the route of biological farming and, a keen interest in soil fertility and enhancing his farm through that way. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll see how your internet does, but we might have to turn off your video in due course. But meanwhile, we're delighted to have you. Andrew, you might just start with, before we talk about your farm a bit more, just about your own journey into agriculture and how that journey has led you to where you are now and how it's changed your farm perhaps over the last while.
Yeah, hi Bridget. I didn't actually start out intending to be a farmer. I studied business and I was going to set the world of marketing on fire until I got a bit disillusioned with it. I was attracted back to, I came from a farm and I was attracted back to it really. I think it was the mix of mental and physical work in farming seemed attractive to me rather than being stuck in an office. So I came back and worked on the farm and did a part-time green cert while I was doing that. And actually as part of that, I did placements on farms in Germany and France, which probably expanded my horizons a little bit. And then, as you say, in the late 80s, as my father was retiring, I took over the farm here.
Perfect, yeah. So, and can you just describe to us kind of the farming system that you have now to date and what it looks like, maybe season by season, what you're carrying out on the farm?
Yeah, well, it's an all tillage farm here. There's when I was a kid, we did overwinter cattle here, but that wasn't still going on when I took it over, and I did actually have an early lambing flock of ewes for a number of years here to while away the winter for myself, which it did very effectively. And unfortunately, it also whiled away a good bit of the spring and early summer when I had a lot of tillage work to do. And at the time, actually, I did the analysis and I was making the same amount per acre off the ground in grass and sheep as I was off the ground in tillage, but I was obviously spending an awful lot of time at that and I was compromising other stuff. So it went back to being full-time tillage. Now the ground around here suits that because this is flat, light textured land. We have kind of moderate rainfall, about 750 mil on average in the year. So the ground is easy to work. Harvests are relatively early, and when you look at the landscape around here, you don't see a lot of grass, even though there are some cows sneaking back in now. So when I took over sugar beet, sugar beet and malt and barley would be a typical rotation here. We were also growing some winter wheat, but really just as a first crop after a break, and some winter barley, largely to spread the workload and spread the harvest out a bit. When I came on board, I brought in peas, which was a bumpy ride, but I've stuck with them. I'm still growing them 35 odd years later, and oats, and those were really extra break crops from the standard cereals, which was useful when we lost sugar beet, say 15 odd years ago. So the rotation now is peas. I've tried some wild grape, but I'm not really sure how I feel about the crop. And followed possibly by winter wheat, or sometimes by a seed crop, which can actually be a more profitable way to do it. You can get a bumper crop out of a first winter wheat after a break, but sometimes if you can get 2 or 3 seed crops in, you'll actually make more in that rotation. So probably a third to a half of the crops are winter sown each autumn, so that'll be a mixture of winter oats. Don't grow a lot of winter barley. It's not really a crop that I've ever got on terribly well with, but so winter oats and winter wheat. Then in this, which we have in the ground at the moment, come the spring now, we'll be sowing peas and spring barley. Yep.
Yeah, and just I was I noticed, like in your video and stuff, between your cover crops, you do a lot of cash crops, and some people would see this as between your cash crops, you do a lot of cover crops, sorry, and some people would see this as maybe a bit more labor intensive, but you see it's quite beneficial to your soil and what you're doing.
Yeah, I really see it as a key part of what we're doing, trying to rebuild soil health. And a bit like the whole biological farming thing, we kind of stumbled into it by accident, because around that 6 or 7, 8 years ago, cover crops were starting to come in a little bit. I don't think gloss had quite started then, but I think it's about maybe 2013 or 14 that we sowed our first cover crop just on a suck it and see basis. And as we've learned more about the soil, and as we've moved away from cultivation of the soil with metal, we're using the cover crops are really a key part of doing that successfully, because they, particularly in, say, if you take your ideal situation really is, where you get the best bang for your buck is probably ahead of a spring crop. So we have, ahead of most of our spring crops now, we have cover crops that are growing away still. The hard frosts in the last few weeks have knocked back some of them, but they're still there, they're still alive. Whereas others, like there's things like linseed and phacelia and that in cover crops now that are not bothered at all by the frost. They're growing away, but they're serving a whole lot of important functions there. They're protecting that ground actually from like that very heavy rain that we had over the weekend here. If you have bare stubble that you're not planning to plow, that's going to get compacted just by the physical impact of the rain. It's going to get it a whole lot harder to dry in the spring. So in that case, we've sometimes, where we haven't managed to get in a cover, we've actually had to go in and disturb the soil in order to let air into it and let moisture back out of it before going in to do our minimal disturbance sowing. And it's a whole lot better to do that with a crop that's sitting there. But that's one effect. It's reducing erosion. If you I'm looking at the rivers around here in the last few days, and they're flowing a sort of a pale brown color, and that's all somebody's soil going down them, and I don't want that to be my soil going down them. So if you've got a living root there, there's much less chance of that soil being washed away for you. But it's also it's a free input. That's a solar panel there that's sucking energy into your soil all winter. And everything that's green is growing, is photosynthesizing, so it's working, it's putting energy in there, and that's to my benefit, but it's also to the benefit of all the biology that it's supporting. Everything there, from the microbes up to the worms. A lot of them are completely dependent on a living root. They need exudates coming out of a root to survive. Now, if I don't have something growing during that long slack period between harvest last July and August and sowing crops next March, if there isn't a living root there, at best they're going to be dormant, or they may die off altogether. So each year then I'll have to try and start the cycle of building up that biology again. So it's really critical that I keep things ticking over there. It's also the fact that I'm producing a lot of organic matter that's there for other microbes to break down. And that's, again, it's an important part of the cycle, is, recycling nutrients. So you've got, your saprophytic things that are going to consume the dead material, break it down. And definitely, well, I'm convinced that year by year we're seeing stuff breaking down faster, as we get further into this, as we build up those populations and we maintain them, so the residues of the cover crops, and even the residue, say, of chopped straw and stubble, and that sometimes disappears remarkably quickly.
And is it fair to say, or is this a kind of a simple version, looking in, I'm not a tillage farmer, that would your cash crops be healthier, or is that kind of a hard variable to kind of say? And would your fertilizer input be less because of the cover crops?
Well, yeah, that would be. I would love to be able to prove that, and I'm hoping that through the work that we're doing with Danu within the next few years, we will actually have evidence of that. Because it's obviously it's a lot of what we're driving to do by rebuilding a more natural system, that our crops are going to be more resilient and less vulnerable to pests, and that's partly the health of the soil, and it is a lot of it, as you say, is fertilizer. It's how you feed your crop. I remember the late Hugh Lovell at one of the first courses I did with them saying, that you don't get up on Monday morning and eat 7 breakfasts. So why do you think you can go out at the start of the season and throw all the fertilizer at your crop? You're just going to make it sick. And so we're using less fertilizer, less synthetic fertilizers, and trying to use less again, and trying to use them more cleverly. So maybe using them, aiming to put on nitrogens with a carbon source, to titillate it, so it's less liable to leach and it's more available to the plant. Maybe looking at foliar feeding of nitrogen, which is, it's becoming more feasible now, more practicable. And I think that way we can probably reduce the total amount of nitrogen by giving it to the crop as and when it needs it. We're looking in much more detail at trace elements and what things may be, inhibiting plant development and making crops more susceptible to pests and diseases. So we're exploring a lot of areas. A lot of this is within Danu, and the people I'm working with in Danu are some of the best brains around. So I'm very lucky, but it is like sucking from a fire hose some of the time, because I'm trying to absorb everything that's going in. So there's work within Danu, and then a lot of that we're doing on the farm in general as well. But the stuff in Danu is looking that it is being measured. The results are being measured. So instead of just being what I instinctively think, and there are so many variables that it can be really hard to pin down exactly what's worked for you in a particular year. But yeah, that's definitely the drive, is to reduce all the synthetic inputs as far as possible, and that starts with feeding the crop properly, having a more healthy crop that's that needs less in terms of pesticides to protect it.
I love your kind of sense of kind of exploring and continuing to be curious about how to best utilize your land. Just going back a step, I mentioned right at the beginning, because it was in your video, you said about 7 years ago now, I suppose, you kind of had a bit of a light bulb moment about how you were farming, and it encouraged you to switch over to biological farming. You might just explain for the people, if they haven't seen your video, what was that, and what it kind of led you down the route of.
Yeah, because I wasn't a deliberate bandit, but I was an ornery enough farmer, and just sort of pragmatic, doing things the way that I thought would work best for me. But I was becoming dissatisfied with. I was disturbed by actually I can see in retrospect now a deterioration from the loss of biology in the soil. But even within my couple of decades of farming, I could see changes happening in the physical nature of the soil, because I wasn't thinking much about biological nature of the soil, because you're not really taught to think much about that. But I could see that this is like land that normally you would plow it, very little cultivation, and a very simple drill would sow it. But and that was still the case. It wasn't that the ground here was getting cloddy, but it was getting looser. You couldn't consolidate it, and if you didn't consolidate it properly, you didn't get good seed soil contact. You could suffer from drought much more quickly. You got poor uptake of trace elements. You'd see stripes all over your fields. And this was, people were starting to bring heavier and heavier equipment into this light land in order to reconsolidate it after disturbing it. And when a local contractor had a Claydon strip drill, I got him I think in 2013, to sow one field for me to see how it would work. And it was quite a difficult spring, 2013. It came on the back of 2012 was a horrible year, and seed coming out of that year was very poor quality. And the rest of my spring crops I sowed in early March when there was a window of nice weather, and then the rest of March turned cold and wet, and I had seed with very poor vigor, struggling in difficult circumstances. And this guy with the Claydon driller told me, no, we leave this until the soil warms up. You need 6 or 7 degrees in the soil, and that's going to be into April, and don't worry about it. And I thought, well, all right, I'll stick with this and see what happens. So it was about the 12th of April, this crop was sown. And it just hit the ground running, it got into the ground, it got up and it grew away, and it was very even. There was none of the sort of striping and stressing that I was talking about in other crops, and it grew fine. It wasn't a spectacularly good crop, but it didn't do that much better than other crops, but it did at least as well as them, having cost an awful lot less to establish. And this looked like a very attractive system. It was easy. I do also remember actually bringing straw in off that field after that harvest, and the loader felt like it had a suspension in it. It was just gliding across the ground instead of hopping and bouncing, because we hadn't disturbed it and then packed it down and because no matter what you do, you get uneven consolidation, unless you bring a steamroller over it. So as the ground then settles back down, it gets less even. So over the following couple of years, I basically migrated the whole system to strip drilling, initially with contractors, and then bought actually an even lower disturbance drill of my own. And that was that was an easier system for me to operate, but I had to start thinking a bit more about the soil, because when you can't actually go in and physically bait it around the place, you have to think about what it's doing. And I think what was very significant for me was actually getting Base was quite a young organization in Ireland at the time, with only about 20 members, but some of them were local here, and I got in touch with them, and that I had the appetite at that stage, and certainly they had the menu to do it. It's a really vigorous, positive sort of a group, with an awful lot of people pushing in the same direction, trying to solve the same problems. And for anybody getting into this, I'd strongly recommend getting in touch with Base, because there's a huge amount of information and support there for people. That certainly brought me onto a completely new level. And yeah, I would say we haven't looked back. Not everything has been perfect in biological farming, or in the progress towards biological farming, but I would say nearly everything has overall been better. It's a system that suits me farming. On my own, with very little machinery, I can actually do the work. I can do an awful lot of work. I don't need fleets of tractors and cultivators and plows and the people to drive those. I can go out and start sowing a field, and if it starts to rain, I can come in and get a cup of tea, and the ground will be dry again in an hour's time, and you go back at it. But you do need to have the patience to wait for the conditions to be right. So while my neighbours are going out in, they can, if they're ploughing stuff, they can plough down slightly wet stuff and get on with things. I have to be patient, and it's like a lot of things. It's taken a different attitude, but the results are there.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, Base Ireland is it means biological agricultural support. It's a support group, isn't it? That
I can never remember what the acronym stands for.
Yeah, I know. But for people, they can look it up, baseireland.ie.
They can look it up, yeah.
Someone I'm sure will put it in the chat.
It really is all about biological, so farming with healthy soils. And it's, in recent years, it's expanded from being largely a sort of a crop-based thing to really covering all enterprises now. There's quite a few dairy people, quite a lot of stock people, sheep, cattle, you name it, they're in it.
Yeah, and I think the nice thing is it's a support group for farmers, with farmers, for farmers, sort of thing, by farmers. We've been told biodiversity agricultural. Okay, so Gareth Culligan has put it in there for us if anyone wants to look it up. So another thing that came out of your video, Andrew, was, there's a section. If anyone hasn't seen Andrew's video, it's a very short 5-minute video on the Farming for Nature YouTube channel. So do check it out. It's very nice and visual, and talks about Andrew's farm and gives a good overview of it. But you have kind of a grassland strip, of which you leave. Now, a lot of conventional farmers would see that as a waste of land around your fields. You might just talk to us. Does that enhance your crops? What do you feel? Why do you do it? And what's it done for your crops? Either?
Yeah, this started with arable grass margins in Glas, which was an option when we joined Glas just over 5 years ago now, and the Glas ones paid for themselves, so it wasn't a hard decision to do them. But I did choose headlands of fields that I knew were particularly difficult, like some stony headlands along by roadways, some ones that were shaded by higher hedges, and could be tricky to get crops to dry in. but they had they had benefits that I wasn't expecting really. One initially that I spotted in the first harvest was in my no-till system now, where I'm really conscious of compaction and wheels on the ground. I now have basically a racetrack around the edge of the field where I can drive the trailers, and anything that doesn't absolutely have to be in the ground is out there, and that's certainly helping the rest of the crops. Like I say, it was taking out the less productive part of the field, so overall output from a field with a, say, 3 meter grass margin around it was impacted much less than I'd expected, because you were taking out the lowest yielding part. And remember, you're spending the same amount per square meter on those low yielding parts as you are on the higher yielding parts. So your gross margin, depending on a lot of things, but your gross margin may not be that much affected. I was struck very quickly by the amount of wildlife in the margins, and it's hard to put a value on that, but like I don't remember seeing butterflies on this farm since I was a kid, and you'd be swatting them out of your way in the middle of the summer. When the particularly when the cocksfoot is flowering, it's just covered in them. The EIP pollinator project at the moment is doing a lot of detailed measuring of stuff, so we'll see how much extra insects there are where we have an arable margin and where we don't. I'm gone from being an anti-insect person to being a very pro-insect person, because most insects are beneficial, and if you get rid of the beneficials, all you're leaving is just room for the predatory ones who'll come in and damage your crops to come in. So I'm very encouraged by anything that I see that way. There's also the thing, if you've got something like an issue with brome, a grass weed coming out, it'll tend to come out from hedges around the field, and if you're in there paring the butt of the ditch with the plow every time, you're bringing that stuff out, or maybe bringing out cleavers or other weeds into a field, and as a result, then you have to stick your sprayer nearly into the hedge in order to control those weeds, and none of that's great. So it's definitely a thing worth looking at. I mean, I don't know if the next loss or rep scheme or whatever it's called is going to support it, but it's definitely an option that I'd encourage people to try, and pick the less productive places, and most people will know there are headlands that are tough and difficult. I'm very happy with them.
Great. Do you know what? When we first spoke to each other, this time last year or whatever, I think the one thing that really struck me, and it was a huge visual, is you said you went into a field one day and you counted, I think it was about 100 skylark and flocks of lapwing and 12 snipe. And I mean, you might just explain to people what's your method to being able to track these birds, or they obviously don't affect your crops, you're not bothered by them being there, but do you have any kind of key message for people who would like to attract these birds into their land?
Well, again, this is a completely unintended consequence of what we're doing, but I think not disturbing the soil and building up that soil biology, and that comes from the microscopic stuff all the way up to the worms and the slugs and whatever else is there, because that's what's there feeding those birds. Having as close to permanent cover on the ground as possible is also a big thing, because you're giving them shelter, you're giving them cover as well as the food, but those numbers are increasing the whole time. I was out with a friend on Saturday, and we were tripping up over skylarks.
Amazing, yeah.
Clouds of them rising up off of the ground, and putting up snipe and fieldfare and redwings and things that absolutely weren't here before. And I'm looking at them as a kind of a barometer that they're only here because there's now life in the soil, and that life in the soil is going to do my job for me. Really, I think all farming is to some degree an interference with nature. It's at best it's manipulating nature to get the result that you want. And the conventional farming was really ignoring that and just treating it as almost like a hydroponic base. A farm was just an area where you would grow crops. It wasn't a natural living system that you took part in, and you interfered with as little as possible, consistent with getting the results and the crops that you need and continuing to make money. Because nature does know best. We had Christine Jones was over here a couple of years ago at the Biofarm conference, and her attitude was really interesting, because it was, there's a lot of very complicated chemistry and physics involved in certain approaches to farming, but really all you're trying to do is mimic nature. And maybe if you didn't wreck your head trying to figure all that stuff out and just stood back and encouraged nature and let it off, it will do this stuff far better than you're ever going to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. I know some of her work is online on YouTube, and the Biofarm had her again this year, so people can sign up and watch that lecture even months later. Before I hand you over to Brendan, just one last question for me there, Andrew, which is where would you, if you were to give farmers advice on where you've got your support and advice to date, where would that be?
Well, I've given the big shout out to Base Ireland, and I would really mean that that's a fabulous springboard for anybody who's curious about these kind of things. And again, the Biofarm conference, Knots is doing some extraordinary work, in events like Biofarm, in courses, in easier times. Their farm walks are also excellent. Farming for Nature, these Q&A sessions, like I've watched a good few of them with people involved in very different areas of farming, but you learn something with every one of those that you watch, and there's a big community of people out there. The web has lots of information. Obviously you want to sift some of it fairly finely, but there's lots of support. But I would say, Base is an excellent community, and I would advise anybody who's interested in getting into this to dip a toe into that one.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Sorry that we've had to turn off your video. I think it's just better for your network, your internet there. So if anyone has any questions for Andrew, please pop them into the chat, and we'll try and get around to as many of them as possible. I'll hand over to Brendan now.
Thanks, Brigid, and thanks very much, Andrew. That's fascinating. I think we're half an hour into the show, and already I think I've learned an awful lot. It's really fascinating. Can I just ask you maybe a little bit about the farm and the generations before you, Andrew? What kind of farming system was there before you really got into the tillage? You said there was a bit of dry stock, but going back to your father's generation and even before that, what was the farm? What did it look like? How did it operate?
It's always been, well, as far as I know, it's been largely a tillage farm. But like Eddie Farm, I guess a few generations ago, there would have been some grass in it. But this, you're in a tillage area here. I mean, I'm literally in the shadow of Bort Malt, the biggest maltings in the country, and I think in my grandfather's time there was maybe close to it. There was umpteen, I don't know what the number was, distilleries within it high. And Patrick Kavanagh wrote about the barges bringing the malt up from it high. So it's a crop area. It's also known as the short grass country because it just won't grow grass in the summer, which is another reason for doing that. But yeah, like definitely we milked a cow for the house when I was a kid. Brother of mine got brucellosis, and that was the end of that one. But I can still remember trying to adapt my palate to bought milk and butter, and it wasn't easy. So, and I guess that's changed. There would have been pigs kept in my father. When my father was a kid here, we didn't keep them. So I suppose things probably have been either specializing or getting more homogenous. Depends what spin you want to put on it. Over the generations. I know that there would be big advantages to having stock within my farm. I don't know that I'm going to do it. I'm trying to make a virtue of proving this can be done stockless, but partly that's I'm terrified of getting into something I know nothing about.
It's quite a challenge, isn't it? And I suppose your own resources in terms of energy and time are finite as well. So you can see the advantages, but it is quite a stretch as well, isn't it, in some ways? And was the farm consolidated much over the years in terms of were fields amalgamated and was there drainage much, or is it pretty much as it was back in your father's time?
Like drainage doesn't, like there are no drains on this farm. It's free drain, and it's our problem really is trying to keep water within the farm. To be honest, there is a natural stream that runs through it, but this ground is very free draining. Fields, I took out one hedge within my lifetime, a short one that separated two fields and made one of them a really awkward triangle. But I was never really tempted to do very much of that. But fields were quite large and workable, even as it was. In the early 20th century, a railway was run through the farm, and that actually at the time, I think my grandfather would have. So because that cut across a lot of fields, he took out some more hedges to make fields into workable blocks. So there would have been several 20-acre fields back in the 19-teens, which would have been very big fields for the time.
And your field boundaries at the moment, Andrew, what would they? I know we talked about the strips, the 4-meter strips around the edge, which look amazing. I'd really recommend people look at the video. What kind of boundaries are typical in that area? Is it hedgerows? Is there walls? Or what do you find?
Yeah, no, hedgerows mainly, and most of them pretty old and actually fairly diverse, even if we have treated them poorly some of the time. But there's so I mean the whitethorn would be the standard hedge around here. So that's a lot of what's in them.
Okay. And just as you talked before about the wet weather, which has caused huge problems, I think, in the tillage sector. Drought, is that an issue? And do you feel that your current system of the more biological farming, has that helped offset very dry summers at all, the impact of very dry summers?
I do. I think it's helping. I think it has a lot more to do, though, before we'll be able to deal with the kind of droughts that we got last year, or even more so in 2018. I sometimes boast that my crops just took longer to die in those years.
Okay.
Just the natural approach, I think it maybe gives you a more adaptable approach to farming. So for instance, like last year when the drought here in late April and May was quite severe, it didn't last quite as long as the one in 2018, but it did a lot of damage. But we had learned some lessons in 18 where we had continued to sort of work with a program of crop nutrition and crop treatments, on crops that really didn't deserve it. So in last year, we sort of banked those lessons and adjusted nutrition on crops and adjusted sprays on crops very much. And so we actually, our margins didn't suffer very much because we were, I spend more time looking at the crops now than I used to. I'm maybe looking at them in a different way, not just to see that they're at a growth stage for a routine fungicide spray, but really to look to see what's actually happening in them. And I think that kind of close inspection allows you to tailor what you're doing on the crop. And that was literally a valuable lesson for me to have learned.
That's interesting. Just on the marketing side then, or in terms of the grain and stuff that you produce, a lot of it goes for, like I said, locally into Athy. Do you have markets for all the other individual products that you go, like the peas and the oats and stuff like that? Do you have, different outlets, and are they well established, or do you have to keep looking all the time?
They are established. Continually looking, and I'd love to expand the range of crops that we're growing to get more diversity, both we're getting lots of diversity into cover crops. I'd like to get more diversity into the cash crops as well. The peas are grown for bachelors for canning. So we've been growing them for them since we started growing peas, and that's a high value market with very high quality standards. So, but if you can meet them, it's worth doing. I'm not, I think you'd probably grow beans rather than peas if you weren't getting a premium for the peas, because they are a trickier crop to grow. We grow a nice bit of seed with for a couple of different seed houses, and that's a kind of an incentive to keep the ground clean, to keep weeds out of it.
What kind of seed, Andrew, do you grow from seed?
We grow oats, barley, wheat for seed. Okay. Yeah. And on the other hand, we're now starting to see it on obviously those ones you need to be buying basic, you're buying basic seed as part of the contract. Where we're not tied into a contract like that, we're tending to save more of our own seed and partly it's an economic thing, but there's also there's a lot of evidence out there that seed grown on your own ground will grow better in your own ground. And well, especially if your ground is becoming biologically active, so that it's adapted to the biology that's there in your ground. I think if you're still horsing everything you can buy onto it, it may not make much difference, but I'm hoping that it will. And it's interesting actually to take your own seed, clean your own seed, put it back into your drill and put it back out on your ground. It sort of feels right.
Yeah, I know from the NOTS event, you mentioned NOTS before, it's a great resource. From the recent biological farming conference, I think there was a lot of information on that, the seed, the value of using the locally grown seed. I'm just, with regard to the markets that you supply, Andrew, is the kind of farming that you do, which is, I think you're on a journey, as you say yourself, but it is obviously very good for soil health and for carbon. You're tying up a lot of carbon and so on, but that's not recognized by your customers, is it?
No, unfortunately, not really. And we keep hearing that these nutrient density meters are just around the corner, where we'll be able to prove to people that the stuff that's being produced in a natural fashion is a more complete and complex diet, nutritionally. I have been growing malt for Waterford Distillery, which is an interesting project. They distill whiskies from individual farms, and it's kind of coming from a winemaking background. So they're looking at what they call the terroir, so the way the soil that the crop is grown on expresses itself in the produce. And I'm not actually a whiskey drinker, but I've tasted sort of the same variety grown in the same year in the same parish, but on two different farms, and you can taste a difference between them. So they probably are onto something. Now they're quite keen on the barley that we're producing, so that might be the start of it. But they obviously have their own way of measuring the quality. But if we could get premiums, it would be a help, because there is a risk, when you do anything like converting to biological farming. If you're changing what you're doing, mightn't be great, but it was predictable. You're introducing more variables there, and if you could, schemes like Glosson that can help to underwrite it in small ways. But if you could get a market premium, it would probably see a lot more people moving in this direction.
Absolutely. Just a final general question, Andrew, then we'll go to the chat, because there's a good bunch of questions coming in. But how do you see all this sort of policy evolution? I mean, do you feel a little bit threatened, or do you feel optimistic about the likes of the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy and the new CAP? Do you think that's going to cause you more problems, or is it going to help you realize opportunities in the direction that you're heading? How do you feel about it?
Do you want some time for questions at the end of this?
You'll have to keep it short.
Yeah, no, look, you mixed feelings naturally. Like there's going to be some good things coming out of it, but there's an awful lot of very empty rhetoric in it too. And I think the fact that the greening of agriculture is coming out of the money that's already been paid to it. You think, yeah, how valuable is the environment? How valuable is nutritionally dense food if nobody is prepared to put their hands in their pocket to pay for it? Because it seems to me that most of the new measures that are going to come will be paid for out of the existing budgets. I hope that they're good measures, but I think that that's fairly hypocritical.
And Andrew, then, given the fact that the markets aren't really recognizing what you do and what you hope to do, and given the fact that policy is limited, as you say, potentially, where do you think the big change is coming from? Obviously, there's a lot of urgency now around biodiversity and climate. Farmers, are a main driving force around the solutions to some of that. But where do you think the impetus for change will come at a scale that will make a difference?
Yeah, well, look at the reservations I have about the funding. I think that I agree with a lot of the principles that are being are proposed to be supported in these biodiversity measures, and I'd love to be reducing my pesticides by 50%, but there's an awful lot of work to be done to actually do that without everybody falling flat on their faces. And I'm not sure that all the people who need to be involved in that are really engaging with it properly yet. So I think that there's a lot of changes. There's a lot of changes to happen there. But I mean, personally, it's the direction I want to be going in. So the more pressure there is to do this and to do the research and to do the work and maybe to give the supports to these things, the better it's going to be for me. So that's, yeah, that kind of sums up like a very mixed feelings about what's going on. But there will be, I mean, good things are going to come out of it. And there, you know, some of the individuals within the department and within Chagascan that, you know, that you meet, you know, they know what's going on, that they understand, but moving large organizations like that, you know, getting a fundamental shift in direction is not going to be easy.
Great answer, Andrew. Thanks a million. Now we'll scoot through some of these questions. So I'll start from the top. Claire Lyons, what type of peas do you sow?
They're called they're small blue peas. So they're smaller than a marifat. They can be slightly blue sometimes, but that's just that's just the name of the type of pea. They're quite like your garden pea. So we'll sow them in March and they'll grow up and flower and pod. But we then let them dry out on the plant, on the haulm, until they're completely dry and dry enough to go through a combine, because they have to be dry and hard, down below 20% moisture, and the whole crop has to be very dry to move through that combine. And it's often said that any boy at all will grow peas, but it takes a man to harvest them. And that's really where the problems come in. It's you generally get one day in the harvest that's suitable that's really good for cutting peas, and you have to drop whatever else you're at and get in there and hope the machine doesn't break down while you're doing it. Because particularly when you're aiming for the quality market, if you miss that one day, you're likely to either, you know, you're going to lose some of your premiums, or your whole crop might end up going for feed.
Okay, great. Question from Catherine Connolly and Brian Walsh around fertilizers. Hi, Andrew. Can you outline what crop input you use as fertilizer on your crops? Is it just organic manures? Could you outline also your crop rotation again, please?
Right. I suppose it was starting the crop rotation one is, so the peas are a non-cereal break, and they'll be followed by, say, possibly a winter wheat, which is a demanding crop. Some ground will grow winter wheat year in, year out. This kind of light land won't do that, but it will grow if you get the right conditions. It'll grow a nice crop of winter wheat after a break crop. Following that, we'll probably go into maybe one or two barleys, then maybe a crop of oats, followed by another barley or so, until we get our peas are run on a 6-year rotation for soil health reasons, that you don't want to be building up pathogens in the soil. So that's a wide rotation. Or sometimes we'll go into a couple of seed crops before that. The fertilizers that we're using are still largely conventional. We're trying to use less of them and maybe use better versions of them. So for instance, if we're using potash, we're trying to use sulfate of potash rather than muriate of potash, as it's a whole lot easier on the soil. And getting a form of that's both affordable and usable can be tricky. But I'm assured by people who know better than me that the same budget spent on sulfate of potash will get you less potash, but it'll get you actually more of it into the crop. We use some chicken pellets as an organic manure. And I've started trying to get those actually out onto cover crops rather than directly onto the cash crops. And I'm trying to do more and more of this with nutrition, and that, you know, even with micronutrients and stuff that we're brewing up here ourselves, to use the cover crop as a way to process nutrients, so that they go, you know, so that they're consumed by the cover crop. And if the cover crop gets too much nitrogen or something, it's not going to have the same dreadful effects as it would in a cash crop, but it can absorb that and then return it to the soil in a more plant available format, so that the plant is able, ideally we want nutrients in stable, you know, unsoluble but stable forms in the soil, so that the plant can access them as and when it needs them, rather than, as I say, trying to ram 7 breakfasts down its throat on Monday morning. And we're working that way, that the cover crops, as well as the other functions I described to Brigid earlier, that, you know, that they may be able to consume nutrients for us and stabilize them within the ground.
Very good. Andrew, from William Tyndall, what sort of tests do you find best for measuring and monitoring the progress of your soil health? Is it just a spade?
Well, yeah, the spade, to be honest with you, like the spade and your eyes and your nose are are pretty good. They will tell you a lot, and the more time you spend at it, the more you get to, you know, the more your instincts develop, and the better tuned in you are to seeing what's there. I mean, some of the life that's there you're going to see. You'll see your worms, but sometimes you'll see your actinomycetes too. We're seeing a lot more mushrooms popping up on the ground in different places, which is good. But in conventional tests, we can, you know, your standard soil tests, obviously you've got to do them for good agricultural practice. We also use we've done some complete soil tests which measure everything that's within the soil, not just the soluble stuff, but actually the complete stuff, so that we know what we have there to try to hack into with our biology. We're using some tissue analysis to see what's actually happening in the growing plant, and recently have been doing some sap analysis, which is supposed to be a more accurate form of doing the same thing. So instead of taking the entire tissue, that the sap is taken out of it, so it shows what's actually traveling within the plant at a given time. You can sometimes have the paralysis of analysis, you know, where you're just looking at too much data and you don't really know what any, you sort of know what it means, but you're not really sure what to do with it. And that's often the tough gap to bridge is, and you know, and that's like Danu is great that way, that, you know, that there's a group of people all doing the same thing with a group of experts available on the end of a line, but it can still be bewildering.
Just one more question for me before we hand back to Brigid, and it comes from Celine Delabre. Have you been able to convince your farming neighbours to care about soil health? Well, I'm sure they care about it, but I suppose maybe the question is, have you been able to convince your farming neighbours of the system that you're advocating? I know you're very involved in BASE and in the Danube project and in the Farmer Pollinator project, but your direct neighbours who probably know you well, Andrew, what's their opinion of what to do, and can you see them adopting elements of your practice, or basically ignoring it?
Yeah, well, some of them are still politely ignoring it, and some of them will have. Well, yeah, no, but some of them are coming around. It's actually surprising, really, when you change your own attitude and open up to things. It surprised me, some of the people who are very well tuned into nature and what's going on, and, you know, farmers around that, I never realized it, but they're spotting things in my fields before I do. Now, so some are starting to move in this direction. Most still aren't, but I mean, there are more cover crops being grown, and guys, for instance, who've signed up to Glasson are doing a cover crop anyway, are beginning to look at the types of covers that we're doing and thinking, well, if I have to do this anyway, you know, should I try a bit harder and try to do it a bit better and not just meet the minimum standards? You know, everyone's going to have their own journey into and do it in their own way, but and I'm sure there's lots of them waiting for me to fall on my face, but it is very different, you know. When somebody does something different, it's a kind of a challenge to you. And I'm sure if my next door neighbor had started doing this a few years ago, I would have seen it as an affront in ways, because until you see an alternative to what you're doing, you can be very defensive about it. So a lot of my plan here is to survive and thrive as well as I can, in order that other people might think, well, we'll try a little bit of this. Yeah,
well, I think in fairness to Andrew, you're doing a phenomenal job in terms of not just what you do, but sharing your story with others and being open to research and contributing to research projects. So it's fantastic. So Brigid, back over to you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. We'll keep at it, Andrew. We'll on to the next question. It kind of leads on from what you were saying, but Tom Tierney has asked, Andrew, what's your next biological step on the farm?
Oh, Jenny, thanks, Tom.
Put you on the spot.
The next biological step on the farm. What's the next biological step on the farm? Over the last autumn and winter, we've started trying to produce some plant feeds myself. So fermenting some stuff using lab lactobacillus bacteria and adding minerals to that to create a feed that will be, you know, biologically active and will act more as a stimulus to the plant to feed itself using this biology rather than simply adding nutrients to it. Now it's a bit tricky, and some of there've been a few disasters, but I think we have a few brews that are looking good now. It's mostly work and effort yourself rather than an awful lot of cost. And I'm hoping that way. I don't think that there's going to be there's no single solution for me that I can say anyway to biological farm. It's a case of keeping everything moving in the same direction. But I'm kind of hoping that one is going to be interesting. And I find it very interesting to actually do it myself.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Luke Moran has asked, do you have any high P and K soils? If so, how do you manage them, nutrient lockups, etc.?
Oh yeah, boy do we. We have phenomenally high pHs on the soil here. Everywhere on this farm is 8+. So that creates huge problems with lockup on the soil. And it's, I often envy people with low pH soil who can go out and spread lime, and I have absolutely no sympathy for them if they don't do it, because if I had an anti-lime I could spread on this soil and sort out my nutrient lockups like they could, I'd be doing it. So yes, we have some very high levels of P on the Morgan's P test here, like certainly up in the 20s and occasionally into the 30s in parts per million. And it's one of the reasons that I'm hoping I can unlock this biological farming, because there's huge resources in this soil to be availed of if we can just get things going. But conventional farming is never going to do that for us. Now, also a lot of the root exudates that are coming out are acidic, and so if we can get root exudates to acidify just the zone around the root, we don't have to clear the whole, we don't have to sort out the whole soil on a test. But if we can just do that, then that'll solubilize some of those nutrients and work in our favor. So yes, I do have I have huge problems with lockup, and it's probably one of the big incentives for me to go biological, because there is no other way I can see to sort it out.
Okay, fair enough. Claire Lyons asks, have you found other ways to deal with fungal diseases, rusts, etc., or have you found changes with fungal diseases with changes?
Yeah, I mean, every year is so different that it's really hard to be definitive about this, and I guess my own approach is changing too. That but in theory, if you feed a crop a proper diet, it's not going to be a good host for fungi or for insects. I can't definitely say that I've achieved that, but I'm certainly cutting down the use of pesticides by maybe being a little bit more tolerant of a small bit of disease in the crop. Now this is thin ice to be walking on, because if you get it wrong, you can lose a crop fairly quickly. And unfortunately, most of the fungicides that we have are prophylactic, so they don't have very much curative. And this is, you could call this the great, agricultural industrial conspiracy if you want to go down that road. But nobody has developed anything to cure a disease for years. It's all prophylactic, which means that you have to enter into a program. So really, as soon as you buy your seed, you might as well go in and bring home boxes of chemicals, because that's the only way that's conventionally that you're going to keep disease out. So it's we're trying, but we don't have it cracked yet.
Yeah, no, it's tricky. Robert Clusson has asked, Andrew, can you describe your present crop pests of concern and your strategies with biological agriculture to reduce their impacts?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of that's been covered in the last answer. Now, there's been several good events recently and John Kempf in the States did a webinar last week actually on flea beetles in oilseed rape and aphids in sugar beet. But I think most of what he was talking about would apply to all crops, and he was really been very specific about the mineral imbalances that are making these crops palatable to the pests, and also incidentally to other ones that are making them vulnerable to fungicides. And he's quite insistent that if you get these simple minerals balances right in your crop, they're not going to be vulnerable to those. So if somebody's thinking about that, I'd certainly encourage you to go back and look at some of that John Kempf stuff. We're going to be trying some of it here this year, and we tried in the autumn with some very simple low cost mineral mixes, like some boron seaweed, magnesium sulfate, so just a few euros a hectare, putting it out on crops with the hope that you're going to make your crop a bit more resilient.
Okay. Mark Ward asks, do you consider the CN ratio when selecting your cover crop mixes? Do you alter your mixes as the season progresses, i.e. after winter barley versus spring barley?
Yeah, you absolutely have to. I mean, the early sowing is the key thing with cover crops, and so after winter oats or winter barley, where you'd be cutting those typically at the end of July. If you can get straight in with a cover, then you can be more extravagant with your mixes of stuff, because everything's going to get a chance to grow. The rule of thumb some people have is that a day in July is worth a week in August is worth the whole of September. And that, my experience would kind of back that up. So yeah, as you get into cutting later crops, or if you get delayed due to say trying to get straw off ground or something, you really have to cut your cloth in your species selection. And sometimes we've got into September, we've just said, nah, it's too late, don't be bothering. But I've more often regretted not sowing a cover than sowing one in a situation like that. Looking at the CN ratios, thinking about it a bit, but it's a tricky one, because if you get something with too much carbon, it's likely to lock up nitrogen, and this could be particularly an issue because we grow a fair bit of spring crops. So that if we've got cover crops in the ground now, and if they're too high in carbon, they're going to absorb a lot of nitrogen just when our emerging crop needs it. Now, I can't say that I've consistently seen that as a problem, even though I haven't been. I mean, I've been selecting stuff on different criteria, really. What's available, what's affordable, what has the type of root structure that I want to, or to get root structure that I want. So whether it's a tap root going down or a more fibrous root just going out about. I select for diversity too, that I try and get as many different families of crops or crops into a cover as I can. So CN ratio wouldn't be a big one, but I'm aware of it.
Brilliant, excellent. There's lots of kind of congratulations, doing an amazing talk, well done. There's a question here from Seamus Murphy. With the wider grass margins in fields, do you find that crow damage the crops is lessened, or is it still an issue?
No, it's actually crows are not a huge issue here, but crow damage isn't actually. Pigeon damage on the peas would be a bigger one, but they'll flight in from hedges. They won't ever really be on the ground. I don't know whether that would be an issue in a crow area. It hasn't been for me.
Okay, and now, I don't know if Robbie Byrne is from the Danube project, but he says, hello, Andrew. Thank you for a great presentation. What are the main benefits to you as a farmer being from a member of the Danube EIP research project?
The main benefit for me as a farmer is that the Danube project is designed to do exactly what I'm trying to do, to figure out how you convert a farm, how you transition it from a conventional system to a biological system. And it's how do you know how far to go without falling through a great big crack somewhere? It's basically it has taken the approach of doing very, very detailed analysis of the physical, chemical, and biological soil as it is at the start. So really, really detailed work, which has been repeated, some of it on a yearly basis, and some of it will be repeated in a massive universal kind of study again at the end to see. And it's a 5-year project. So the same plots are maintained on the farm over the 5 years, and the same level of treatments on them. So there's a control one that gets everything as conventional as possible. There's another one that gets it conventional, but with a carbon source added to all nitrogen going onto it. The fourth one gets that plus mineral balancing according to the soil and plant tests. And the final one gets all of the above plus biological amendments. And the idea is that over the course of 5 years, we see not just the changes in the crops that we get, but what actual changes are happening within the soil. And it's as you can see, it's a massive task. There's a lot of measuring involved. There's a lot of head scratching about what's the appropriate thing to put on a crop in each of those 4 plots in a particular year. But if you're curious about that, and I'm very curious about it, it's great, because I have Robbie is involved in it, and I have people like Robbie who have to answer my questions when I ask them, because I'm in Danu. It's great, but it can be fairly demanding too.
It sounds like it's a really nice kind of peer to, because it's farmers doing it and farmers are engaged in it. There's so much that you're probably learning off each other, and the peer-to-peer.
An enormous amount, and it's half the farmers are involved in crops and half of the farmers are in grass, and there's a surprising amount of synergy between the two sides, because your grass is another crop. It's a different one to the annual ones that we're harvesting, but the same things are going to be good for it. And I've probably been more intimate with grass people than I have in most of my farming life through Danu, and I found it very educational.
Yeah, I can imagine. A lot of people have said what a great presentation. It's lovely to listen to you, and I have to say I totally agree. There's a huge amount of knowledge, expertise, and thank you so much for sharing all of that with us tonight, Andrew. I'll let you go shortly, but just one last question. What would your top tip be for any farmer in Ireland, conventional or otherwise, intensive or extensive, of something that you could do for nature, a quick win-win? What would your top tip be?
It would be suck it and see. Try something. Try something small. Don't get too big or don't get too ambitious. Don't because but try something that you're comfortable with and watch. So like if you're using a conventional system, say for crop establishment of ploughing, tilling and sowing, do like I did, get a contractor to come in and strip till one field, and pick your field, give them a nice one, and just see what happens. Have a look yourself, or try a cover crop if you haven't before. It's not going to break you, and again, see what happens. Or little things, look at your hedges. How are you maintaining your hedges? If you're skinning them, short back and sides, consider just letting them grow up. You can continue to breast them if you feel you absolutely have to, but let them grow up and just see what happens. Everyone is going to have their own way of doing this, and everyone knows their own farm best, and everyone's circumstances and dispositions are different. But if you don't try something, you're never going to know. So take a little risk.
Do you know what? I think your message, kind of the curiosity and taking those little risks and stuff, it's very inspiring, and it's kind of led you to a different journey than, well, marketing is what you originally started out. But listen, thank you so much. It's great to have spokespersons like yourself for nature, and it's a privilege to have you here tonight. Just before I go, Andrew's video is on YouTube, so feel free to look at it. If you know of anyone that was unable to make it tonight, the recording of this session will also be up on YouTube, and it's there are handy things to listen to, like podcasts and your tractor and your car, so feel free to share it. It should be up on YouTube by tomorrow afternoon. If you have any questions for any of our ambassadors, do pop them up on our forum, our online forum, and people like Andrew or other farmers can interact with people who have questions there. Next week we have Trevor Harris, who's also from County Kildare. He's involved in beef, sheep and horticulture, and he's organic and biodynamic, so we look forward to seeing him. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. A great pleasure. Brendan, is there anything else you'd like to ask, or one last question?
No, just to echo my thanks. I suppose with Farming for Nature, we see farmers as being a huge resource in addressing our climate and biodiversity crises. And I think always with farmers, they learn best and most from each other. And I think Andrew's a wonderful example of just exactly how that happens. He's learning from his farm, he's sharing his story, and it's just fantastic. So I'm delighted, Andrew, that you're part of this network, and also such an active part of great organizations like BASE and Danu and the Farm and Biodiversity Projects. So keep up the good work, and thanks so much for tonight.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us. We'll see you again next week.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.